Thank you everyone for joining us for our last morning panel. There's one after this, but it's Sunday, and thank you for joining us. This is local climate change law, and we have the privilege of having two great speakers with us this morning. We have Jolene Lin, professor from the University of Hong Kong, and Melissa Powers, professor from Lewis and Clark Law School. Thank you for joining us, and here's an awesome panel.
Thanks for coming, everybody. Our third panelist, Ben Richardson, who is up at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, unfortunately isn't able to join us today because he's really sick, which is actually really too bad because Ben is actually the person who not only organized this panel, but he organized a workshop about a year ago and a book that focuses on local climate law from around the world. And so at this conference and in the book, we were able to learn a lot about what's happening in several Canadian cities, in a couple of European cities, in Australian cities, in South Africa, and a couple of other developing country cities. And it provided us with a really good understanding of what's actually happening locally and what role local governments actually can play in addressing climate change, which of course is a global, not just a local or national issue. So you're only going to get a snapshot today of this issue of local climate law. And the other thing I guess is a little bit too bad, I think, from having Ben missing is Ben actually would question, at least to a certain degree, the value of local governments playing a role in climate change mitigation, especially if we think about the small impact that local governments can play in the context of global emissions and state actions and international actions. You won't get quite that same perspective from the two of us. So you might get a little bit of a Pollyanna approach, so maybe after we speak, if people want to challenge what we're saying, that's totally fine with us. But we're going to just dive into our discussion of local climate law, and Jolene's going to begin by talking about what's been happening in different Chinese cities.
Great. Thanks, Melissa. Well, hi everyone. Good morning. It's really nice to be here. It's my first time in Oregon, so this is my first time here, and it's just been great. Well, we've been blessed with great weather, so this is apparently unusual. So basically, I think one of the things that Ben wanted to do was to also kind of frame the discussion. And since he's not here, Melissa and I will try to incorporate that sort of discussion within our presentations. So one of the things that, basically was one of the questions that inspired Ben to look at local climate change law was, first of all, the stalemate in international negotiations, which indicates that we're not going to have a very strong, or we basically have a very weak international regime to address climate change law, to address climate change. When the conference was put together, it was in 2011. It was a time when the notion of post-2012 was still viable, and so people were still hoping that there would be a significantly strengthened post-2012 international framework governing climate change. At that time, there was potential that the European Union would continue to play its leadership role in the international climate change negotiations, specifically the United Nations, that China would jump on board and lead with it the BRIC countries, Brazil, South Africa, India, and that the US would come on board. So with these three big players, that would have been absolutely crucial to the successful creation of a post-2012 framework. That's not happening. That has not happened. The financial crisis, which then led to an economic crisis, which we still find ourselves in today, has led to a very significant backdrop against which climate change is being discussed, especially in my part of the world. That's one of the things that has to be taken into account. Secondly is that the idea that the trend that we were seeing in the US was pretty interesting, because despite Washington taking a pretty let's not talk about climate change till it's absolutely crucial. And because climate change was such a economic issue, especially in trade ties with China, we saw that a lot of cities, states were taking on their own initiatives, and in fact may have had the impact of leading and influencing this federal government to take on more aggressive action to really address climate change mitigation as well as adaptation. So that's basically one of the things that we saw was like, wow, this is interesting because you're looking at local, non-state actors playing a role. And I think that brings me to the third point, which is that I'm primarily an international environmental lawyer, and so my interest has always been on how do we tackle, or how have we tackled environmental issues at an international level using the tools that we have. And climate change is one of those environmental issues that has really challenged international law, because the tools that international laws have, essentially treaties, and the focus on states, is not equipped to address such a complex issue as climate change, especially because the changes that are needed to really address climate change really involves cooperation with private actors, the private sector, corporations, industry, etc. So my focus has therefore been looking at the alternatives. How do we do that? So I'm just going to dive into my presentation on China. Right, so the title of my chapter in the book was Climate Governance in China Using the Iron Hand. And the reason I picked this title was because the few weeks before the presentation, before I started writing this chapter, the premier, so it's like the equivalent of the US president, the premier of China, Wen Jiabao, vowed to realize the country's green goals of cutting energy intensity by 20% between 2006 and 2010. And he told the nation that all governments at all levels would work with an iron hand to eliminate inefficient enterprises. So the idea was that what is an iron hand and what does this entail? So basically, the central argument of that, the central argument that I advance is that climate governance in China is predominantly top-down, and it's very bureaucratic. The local initiatives to address climate change have tended to be responses to policy directions and performance targets imposed by the central government in Beijing. However, what is an interesting transnational dynamic is that local governments have also started pairing up with international aid agencies and multilateral agencies like the World Bank to implement clean development mechanism projects on the ground. So the clean development mechanism is one of the mechanisms, one of the three flexible mechanisms under the Kyoto Protocol, which briefly allows developed countries to earn carbon credits for investing in clean energy projects in developing countries. And to date, China is the largest recipient of CDM funding, although the highest number of CDM projects are found in India. The reason why there's a disparity is because the carbon credits really are calculated based on the amount of carbon saved by the project. And most of the projects in India, while numerous, are very small-scale, rural, renewable energy projects, which therefore do not create as much carbon credits as the large-scale industrial projects in China.
What is CDM, please?
Sorry, CDM. CDM is the Clean Development Mechanism. It's one of the three flexible mechanisms under the Kyoto Protocol, which allows developed countries like Germany, which is one of the biggest players, to invest in clean energy projects in developing countries and then get credited with carbon credits for its initiative. So the main incentive for developed countries to invest in CDM projects is that they get credits which can be used to satisfy the treaty obligations under the UN, or they could be sold in the international markets. So yeah, that's basically that. Okay, so just a quick snapshot about China and why it is that, and what's the background, what are the drivers behind Chinese climate change policy. Well, first of all, China has reportedly surpassed the United States as the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter. So that's basically based on data that has been collected annually by the International Energy Agency. So annual carbon dioxide emissions from China grew by about 4 billion tons between 1992, which is the year that the Kyoto Protocol came into force, and 2007. More than 70% of this increase occurred between 2002 and 2007. But it doesn't simply reflect higher GDP growth during this period. Over these 5 years, there are a number of reasons why carbon dioxide emissions grew by such a great amount. 3 main reasons would be one, exponential growth in exports. So basically it's a case of China being the world's sweatshop, and basically that's where all the products are being manufactured. So carbon emissions there are, have grown significantly in this period. Secondly is basically the building of infrastructure. Lots of Chinese cities are busy upgrading, and not even really upgrading, you're talking about building roads, building bridges, building flood defenses. So all this infrastructure has there's been a significant rise in infrastructure construction during this period. So unlike developed countries where emissions from households usually make up the lion's share of carbon dioxide emission, that's not the case in China. Households in China represent about 25% of carbon dioxide emissions, and of course, urban households are far more carbon intensive than rural households, but China remains predominantly rural. So that's the other thing to note about China in terms of the energy profile is that China is heavily reliant on coal to generate energy. In 2009, coal was used to generate 95% of China's energy, simply because China has huge deposits of coal. China is increasingly using natural gas and oil, but the amount is still not substantial. And of course, in the last few years, despite the apprehensions caused by the nuclear disaster in Fukushima in Japan, the Chinese government has decided to go ahead with what they have termed its nuclear renaissance, which means that it's going to try to tackle climate change by shifting its production of energy from coal to nuclear. So the thing about the Chinese political leadership is that in the beginning of the climate change discourse, starting from 1992, was that the Chinese government's position was very simple. Based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, which is a fairly well-established principle in international environmental law, China argues that yes, it has the common responsibility with the rest of the global community to address a global problem like climate change, but the responsibility has to be differentiated to reflect China's different economic and social needs. Basically what it's saying is that we may be a big country, but we are a poor country. And if we look at and China's argument at the time was bolstered by a number of solid facts, which is one, at that time, more than half of the country was living on less than $1 a day. So So poverty eradication is a major focus of Chinese policy, and rightly so. At least in my opinion, sorry. Rightly so in my opinion. Secondly, at that time, the energy, the carbon dioxide emission, or the amount of carbon dioxide emitted by per person was very, very low. So compared to, say, in Europe, where per person is like about 8.1 tons of carbon dioxide per person per year, and in the US it's about 16.9 tons. In China, it hovers at about 1.7. That reflects the fact that many parts of China is still not connected to the electricity grid, and people are not being able to enjoy easy access to energy. So that's one thing that was the case. However, this position on the international platform has changed a lot since then. As of the Copenhagen Conference and the Copenhagen Conference of the Parties in 2009, which was the international conference of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, where they were hoping to hash a deal for the post-2012 regime, China began to acknowledge that climate change was not an issue that it could entirely say we have no role to play, and we're going to have to play a more active role. So what was the so-called more active role it would take? So China made 3 pledges at the Copenhagen Conference, basically to reduce its carbon dioxide emissions by certain amounts. These were the international pledges. So basically, with making those pledges on the international stage, China had to do something on the local level. Like, how was it going to fulfill those international pledges? Basically, to put it briefly, China is a communist country. Since 1979, when it was decided that it could no longer pursue communist or Soviet policies to economic activity, it has liberalized economically. But the politics of China, including the way it governs internally and the way it relates to the world, remains quite staunchly communist. Now, this is something that is hard to portray and capture in the literature, because the Chinese scholars who are trained in China or who are steeped in Chinese political economy cannot see that distinction, because their way of thinking or their worldview is firmly communist. And for the people who are writing about China outside China, particularly those publishing in the American law journals, they take the view of an American perspective of China. So it's very interesting for me, because I'm not Chinese, but I'm Chinese. I'm overseas born Chinese, and I'm very familiar with the way the Chinese think and feel, and that sort of affects the politics. But I'm not Chinese in the sense where I'm like, no, this is clearly not the way that it's, whether it's communist or not. Now, why this point is important is that when we look at Chinese climate change policies, the way it has been implemented is firmly by resorting to a very, very Soviet system of what they call the cadre system. The cadre system is like a civil service system that is used to, it is an administrative and bureaucratic system that is used to regulate all aspects of life in a Soviet society. So what happens is every person is given a position, like a role to play in the cadre system. Now, what are the incentives in the cadre system? Because you don't have bonuses. You don't have like the possibility of promotion unless you do something amazing. But what they do is that it's a system of carrots and sticks, just like any other system. When it comes to climate change, what has happened is that while in the past, the economic planning of China was firmly focused on GDP, on increasing gross domestic product, during each 5-year period. In 2009, after making those pledges at the International Copenhagen Conference, the Chinese government included for the first time environmental targets within its 5-year plan. So basically, the National Climate Change Program, which is a document widely available on the internet and has been, translated, and there's an authoritative English version out there, tells us how those targets translate into local targets. What has happened is that they have a state target, which is to reduce energy intensity by 20% between 2006 and 2010, and it has now been extended to 2011 to 2015, and is most likely to be extended from 2015 to 2020 because we don't see much action being taken and much of this target being realized. What happens is that they have a provincial target, which is then disaggregated into local targets, which are the targets that the local government officials have to try to achieve. Now, so 2 things here. There are 4 levels of government in China below the state government. So you have the central government based in Beijing. That is equivalent to the federal government situated in Washington. It's very, very powerful. Beijing has always been the seat of government for thousands of years. And central government is very, very autocratic. So this concentration of power in Beijing should not be underestimated. After that, you have the provincial government, followed by the county government, and the last and lowest level would be the prefectural government. For the purpose of Chinese politics literature, as well as the focus that I've taken in my paper, I have not been interested in looking at county and prefecture politics. I'm focusing on provincial government policies. So I was looking at how provincial governments sought to achieve the local targets set by the Beijing government in realization of the international pledges that Beijing had made. Basically, what has happened is that first of all, it's very difficult to generalize about how different provinces react to the targets. A number of reasons here. Firstly, as is no-brainer, provinces differ greatly in their financial and capital resources and also human talent to address these issues. There is a huge divide in China between the East and the West in terms of its geography as well as its wealth. The provinces on the eastern coast have traditionally been the coastal provinces, which have flourished because of international trade. And the western provinces tend to be landlocked and are far poorer. Therefore, if we are to see any significant climate change mitigation and adaptation, it would be on the eastern coast, not on the western coast, because the western provinces, landlocked. Western provinces are far poorer. And also, just as a statistic, in Shanghai, the number of environmental protection, a number of officers working in the local environmental protection agency would be about, I think it's about 150 officers in a city of about 10 million people. In Xinjiang, it's an office of 50 people governing an area that's about 100 times the city of Shanghai. It doesn't have 10 million people because it's mostly desert, but it's a very, very vast area. So that's one thing. That's the resources issue. Secondly is what are the factors that, what are the drivers that motivate local government response? So I identified 3 main things that local governments bear in mind. One is psychologically, one of the factors affecting local government action is that there is a perception of climate change as a global issue, and therefore it's the business of central government, and local governments shouldn't need to deal with it. And because climate change has become such a political issue, local governments all the more think of it as a foreign policy concern, not something for the local people. Secondly, is that there is not much pressure on the ground for local governments to take action on climate change because there is very low public awareness about climate change amongst the local people in China. There was a study conducted 2 years ago by the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP. It was just a survey of people in Beijing, which is the capital city. And the survey showed that very few people understood what climate change is about. And there was a lot of people tend to confuse climate change with conventional air pollution, which is a major concern in Chinese cities. So that's two. There's no pressure on the ground. So the local government officials have no incentive to respond to any form of political pressure or political action. Secondly, is their taxation system. China introduced a fairly complex taxation system in the early 90s, in 1994. I'm not a tax person, so I'm not going to try to delve into it, but the essence of it for purposes of climate change is that the taxation system is such that some of the taxes collected by the local government go directly to the central coffers. Some of the taxes collected go only to the local government, and some taxes are shared. The primary sources of tax for the local government would be business tax, tax on property, tax on capital. So there is a clear incentive for local governments to try to promote business activity because that's where they get the bulk of their expenditure, their tax money. What this also means is that if there is a perception that tackling climate change will affect economic development, your local government officers are really not excited about it because for them, maintaining economic development is important because the taxation system not only rewards business activity because that's the source of the income for the local government expenditure under the taxation system is far heavier than central government. So providing for schools, education, public hospitals, healthcare, so basically healthcare, education, and environmental protection are actually paid for by local government, which means there would be also huge disparities in quality provided across the entire country. Now finally is the issue of capacity, which is the major issue in a lot of environmental law. When we talk about implementation, we talk about enforcement, we're talking about how do we build capacity. That's something that's a big problem, and I've already alluded to it before. So the other thing that I was looking at was how then did local governments achieve those targets? Because they actually did, quite a lot of them did. It was actually quite interesting. Some provinces took a very effective but blunt approach to achieving those targets. So there was the province of Wenzhou in Zhejiang, which basically decided that for every 4 days of providing the people with electricity, 1 day everything shuts down. So 20% is 1 in 5. So 1 in 5 days, you're gonna get 20% cut. So I was like, wow, that's super awesome, right? So yeah, so that went into like national headlines. Obviously, like as some of you might have heard, like in China now, government by the people is by blogging and tweeting, which is the equivalent of Twitter in China is Weibo, which is microblogging, and it was hysterical. People were just really lambasting the Wenzhou government. However, that did not stop them from doing it for 2 months until the central government told them that was not what they had in mind. The other thing that people did, the other strategy which I thought was quite interesting was how the local governments tried to align incentives when they were dealing with state-owned enterprises and private enterprises to try to cut emissions. When it comes to state-owned enterprises are just basically companies that are owned directly or indirectly by government. So it's like sovereign funds. And state-owned companies are major entities in China. They still control a large part of the Chinese economy. The state-owned enterprises are usually run by former generals or people who have strong ties with the political establishment in Beijing. One of the ways that the local governments tried to achieve their goals was to work closely with the people who run these enterprises and say something like, look, if you manage to help me achieve my target this year, I will make sure I put in a good word with your superior so that you'll get promoted. And that's really powerful. That sort of power was useful in terms of a lot of action by the state-owned enterprises. And we do have a number of case studies on that, particularly the state-owned enterprises in the coal sector. The third part was with the private enterprises. Well, basically that one, just to put it briefly, local governments have significant power over local banks. Local banks usually don't make loans based on credit history, but based on political concerns as well. So if the local mayor makes a call to the local bank manager and says, I want you to withhold that loan from company X because I don't like his face, because he refuses to help me cut my carbon emissions. That can be done, and that has been done. Of course, this has also created a lot of unhappiness, but that is the reality for how some of these issues were addressed. Okay, so I'm not going to try to talk too long. But the last point I wanted to make was really like, what does it say to us, all this stuff, in terms of local climate change law? When Ben first asked me to write this chapter, first I was like, whoa, I'm going to have to engage in a huge moral dilemma about the word law. Because law on the books and law as it operates in a society is very different, particularly in a very complex political system like China. So I use the word governance, and I borrowed that word governance from the political science literature because I wanted to take an approach that was more socio-legal, that really looks at the dynamics and the factors that influence how local governments tackle climate change in China. So that's one thing. Secondly is, mine is a very theoretical, I try my best to, engage with the empirical research, but I think that this is a call for more empirical research to be done by, say, legal sociologists, because each city and each province is different. The dynamics are different because of the very primary role played by individuals. So for example, Taiyuan Iron and Steel, which is one of the biggest coal state-owned enterprise in China, is run by a tyrannical crazy man. And the fact he's tyrannical and crazy means that a lot of the policies that revolve around him are very unique. And that's very different from some of the other state-owned enterprises. So that's the other thing. I think this is a general point as well when we talk about local climate change law, is the importance played by what we call norm enterprises, people, individuals, who could really make a difference if they wanted to. A positive example is the mayor of Hainan. Hainan is a very small island at the southern tip of China. It's got a very pleasant climate. And the Hainan mayor decided that ecotourism was the way to go for the island of Hainan. And he has done great things in helping to preserve the very beautiful environment of Hainan, which is very rare amidst a lot of environmental degradation across China. All right, so on this I'm gonna end, but I'll be so happy to take questions and hear your comments after Melissa presents. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to be talking about what's happening here in the U.S. in terms of municipal climate plans, and I'm focusing in particular on cities in the U.S. I should note that there are actually a number of suburbs and rural areas that have also taken action and could play a meaningful role in climate change as well. But I'm most interested in cities, largely because cities account for about 70% of both domestic and global climate change emissions if we want to divide the emissions into regions. So here's just a brief snapshot of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions if you were to categorize them. And if you look at electricity generation and transportation as the two dominant sources, these are actually two areas in which we could significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, both on the source side by regulating, for example, the types of fuels we use or the types of power plants that we build, but also by regulating our energy use, so demand side measures as well. And so if we think about, this is just another picture of our greenhouse gas emissions, when we look at sources and then end uses, just thinking about roads, for example, as an end use, you could get at 20% or so of your greenhouse gas emissions. And if you think about buildings, you're dealing with another 45% almost of your end-use emissions. And this is really where local governments are going to play a meaningful role. So this is just another picture that shows this, and when we think about our direct emissions and then our end-use emissions, consumptive emissions, the combination of both the orange color and the blue color indicate what role we have in terms of demand side management. But I want to emphasize I'm not just suggesting that that's where we focus our energy. I think that climate change mitigation is going to involve a range of regulatory actions at the federal level, at the state level, and at the local level. But for these things to be effective, we have to engage both local and federal and state. So if we think about our climate change emissions as being driven both by our production end and our consumptive end, in my view, you could really draw some clear lines between the primary role of the federal government and the primary role of local governments. And then the state actually can go kind of both ways, depending on how states are set up to regulate and the willingness of states to regulate. So first of all, source emissions, extremely important, and actually something that's been happening on the federal level, albeit slower than most of us would like to see. But what we see in terms of both federal regulatory authority and then federal action, there's a strong, actually predominant role of the federal government in regulating stationary sources, so stationary things that are fixed or don't move. So this is where we're thinking about coal plants, gas plants, industrial facilities, and most of that regulation is happening right now under the Clean Air Act, which regulates new and modified sources of pollution. It's not getting at existing sources, which is a huge gap. Federal government also regulates the types of fuels that we use. Predominantly, again, under the Clean Air Act, there's a renewable fuel standard, which is a bit of a disaster, but it could become much more effective if one were to modify it. The federal government plays a very substantial role in all types of energy sector regulation, including, for example, the Federal Power Act, which allows FERC to get involved in transmission pricing, wholesale electricity pricing. It also, the FERC gets involved, and actually other federal agencies get involved in permitting of facilities and permitting of energy operations, which if they were more effective, we could see a lot more mitigation. And then agricultural sources can also be regulated through federal laws, especially if we're talking about end-of-the-stack emissions. Now, the federal government also has a preemptive role in certain areas of end-use demand. Most importantly, fuel economy standards under the CAFE program, the corporate average fuel economy standards, are subject to exclusive federal regulation, as are certain areas of energy efficiency, most predominantly heating and air conditioning systems, HVAC systems, are subject to federal standards, not local standards. But that still leaves a huge role for local governments to be playing in terms of regulating end use or energy demand. Local governments are the ones who enact transportation policies and drive land use decisions. And land use, when we think about the transportation sector, and you think about personal vehicle use, which is the dominant contributor to transportation emissions, that's all local or state. When we think about building code efficiency standards, that's almost all local, cities that are passing codes about this. If we think about local activities that can take up more carbon dioxide or offset some of the emissions that we have, so tree planting, development of green spaces, that's all local. And then waste in food production can be driven very heavily by the local governments. And then one area in which has been really overlooked, you'll see these in local climate plans, but they're not really regulating very meaningfully, is local governments have a huge potential role to play in alternative energy production and basically renewable energy production. And they're not stepping up to the plate, but they certainly could and have a significant impact. So we already have a lot of federal action on the books or coming. So we have the federal government has probably played the biggest role in terms of vehicles. We have vehicle emissions standards as a result of the Clean Air Act. We have miles per gallon standards, so average fuel economy standards that are basically going to require by 2025 vehicles to achieve 54.5 miles per gallon economy standards. Most people look at the vehicle program as probably the most successful area of federal regulation. We also have the federal government enacting efficiency mandates and other types of mandates on local buildings, federal buildings and federal lands. Federal land solar development, the Department of Defense, you might be surprised, is probably one of the bigger developers of renewable energy within the federal system. As the federal government replaces its buildings, it has to meet pretty aggressive federal efficiency standards. Stationary sources is another area in which the federal government has been acting. Basically by requiring very large new and modified sources. A modified source is a facility that undergoes a physical change that increases its emissions under the Clean Air Act. And the federal government has enacted greenhouse gas measures, but these set very high emissions thresholds. Their carbon dioxide equivalent emissions need to be, for new sources, 100,000 carbon dioxide equivalent tons. If it's a modified source, you have to increase your emissions by 75,000 tons measured in carbon dioxide equivalent. The carbon dioxide equivalent measures the heat trapping effect of a greenhouse gas. For carbon dioxide, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. So what this effectively means for our major greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, is that if you have an existing source and it makes a change, to be subject to federal regulation, it needs to increase its emissions as a result of the change by 75,000 tons emissions annually. It's a very significant increase in emissions. And so we're really getting right now through the federal regulatory program at the big facilities, the coal facilities, major industrial sources, and only really the new facilities and the modified facilities. And you have to want to modify to be subject to this regulation. And so we're not really seeing a whole lot of existing source regulation as a function of federal controls. So we could ultimately, over time, as facilities retire, see increasing regulation of greenhouse gases from major sources. But in practice, I think it's going to take a very long time for these federal regulatory controls to have a meaningful effect on our existing fleet of fuel sources and our existing industrial fleet. So we have to be getting at our greenhouse gas emissions through something other than just federal control based on where the politics are. We are not going to see a comprehensive climate change bill in the foreseeable future. Anybody who thinks that's going to happen, I think, has not paid attention to the House of Representatives for the past 20 years. I mean, it's just not going to happen politically, and there's no pressure really at the White House level to produce this. And we're also seeing actually a big backlash right now federally by members of Congress against the significant financing that we've provided for renewable energy sources through tax credits and subsidies. And there was a big sort of hurrah moment at the beginning of this year when, as part of the fiscal cliff deal, which is different than the sequester deal, but the fiscal cliff was when we were going to have all these tax rates jump at the end of the year. One thing that happened is we lowered various tax rate increases and also renewed a key subsidy for the wind sector. It'll last for 1 year. It won't have a meaningful impact, and the appetite for subsidies on a federal level has really, really declined. So if we can expect our federal government to take meaningful action in the near future, and I'm a little bit cynical that we can, then we have to start thinking about local action as being a much more meaningful role, and expecting our local and state governments to start enacting more aggressive policies. And we're seeing this, actually. We're seeing states and especially municipalities step up to the plate. And I think they can play a meaningful role, but as I'm going to talk about, they need to go a lot further than they've been going. So what's been happening at the state level? First of all, let's just pull out California for a second and think about the other states. In the Northeast, we have states enacting a regional greenhouse gas emissions trading system. It's actually been relatively successful. The carbon prices are relatively low. It's not a very effective market-based system, but it is actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and it's limiting development of new carbon-intensive sources. The coal industry is probably actually on the ropes at this point. Most people don't expect significant development of coal-fired power plants moving into the future. But the system doesn't impose meaningful caps on natural gas emissions, and so we need to be stepping up regulatory actions at the state level to avoid having natural gas displace coal. And the reason that's important is because, first of all, it might be that natural gas indirect emissions pale or offset any combustion emission benefits that you would get from natural gas. That was a complicated way of saying you take the life cycle emissions of natural gas, they might actually be bigger than the life cycle emissions of coal. Even if that, this is contentious scientifically, but even if that isn't accepted as a scientific matter, what we're doing right now is we are investing in new natural gas infrastructure that is going to last for 30 or 40 years. And once you have that infrastructure in place, all of our other regulatory systems basically ensure that that stays in place for a very long time. And this locked-in infrastructure is a very dangerous thing for us to be engaged in if the climate science indicates that we have to basically decarbonize our energy system. So we need to have response actions in place. We're seeing some of these response actions at the state level through California and its economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions mandates. But we might also see more effective measures at the local government. And so this is where I'm going to just talk a little bit about the role that municipalities can play, and then where there's a gap in terms of what municipalities can do. So first of all, the main job of municipalities is basically to offset energy demand. If you decrease energy demand and other fuel demand, you lessen the impetus for development right now of carbon-intensive energy sources, whether it's coal or natural gas. Those who build energy facilities need somewhere that they can sell the energy that they're producing. And if we lessen demand, they have less reason to build, which gives us a little bit more time to develop more effective national and state level mitigation policies. Cities can also play a meaningful role in developing alternative energy sources, especially distributed renewable energy generation. And finally, and Jolene mentioned this, but I want to emphasize how important this is. Cities are the arena in which you develop norms, and those norms will filter up to change the policies at the state and national level. And as lawyers, we don't think about that very much. The social scientists do, the political scientists do. But I just want to emphasize how important that is in terms of affecting policy. Okay, so what's happening just briefly in terms of municipalities? Land use and transportation is the mechanism that you reduce vehicle miles traveled, especially passenger vehicles. And limiting sprawl has a meaningful effect on transportation efficiency and also on building efficiency. Local governments are the ones who deal with building efficiency. Local governments are the ones that deal with waste generation and the resulting methane emissions, and food waste and the resulting methane emissions. Although I just want to emphasize that the emphasis on local food as necessarily being a climate benefit it's actually much more complicated than that, and a lot of the science doesn't necessarily show that you get a clear benefit. You might be better off sometimes buying remote food that's more efficiently produced, even when you consider the vehicle miles traveled to get your food to where you're going to consume it. But there is better science talking about waste control as a reduction in methane emissions. And then finally, local governments can really offset the heat that results from climate change. And this actually has aggregate climate benefits. If you have a cooler city as a result of more trees, you use less air conditioning, which means you use less electricity to power your air conditioners, which means you have lower greenhouse gas emissions. And then energy regulation, as I said, is a big area in which we can see much more effective mitigation measures. There are a couple of things to note about the role of local governments in terms of energy. The first is that if you have a municipal power utility, they are actually exempt from federal preemptive regulations. And this is important because this means that municipalities can basically decide to enact certain policies that states are actually preempted from doing. So people like to talk about feed-in tariffs, for example. Feed-in tariffs are preempted under federal law. And if you want to see a meaningful incentive payment, you're going to have to look outside of the federal system to get that, at least under our current federal electricity structure. Okay, so the last thing just generally about the city dynamic is this role of norm setting. And this is actually how cities have been developing their climate action plans. They have been tapping into the existing community norms and spinning those community norms out in a way that gets the community to embrace mitigation actions that they might not otherwise. And if you look at different city plans and you look at what they actually emphasize very different things. Most cities don't talk about climate mitigation as a greenhouse gas mitigation strategy. Instead, they look at whatever it is that they think their community is going to support and use that as the metric to develop climate policies. So, and I've categorized these in sort of a greener, fitter, hipper, better way. And what I'm talking about when I use these terms is that cities self-identify with certain behaviors or certain impressions. And if we think, I'm sure everybody has seen Portlandia or heard about Portlandia, that whole show is about playing off of Portland's self-conception of itself. Right? Portland is super hip, Portland is super sustainable, it's green, it's hip, and Portland actually thinks it's better than everybody. And you actually see this built into Oregon's climate policies. New York, very aggressive local climate action plan. It is all about New York being the most sustainable city and better than everybody else. And everybody who's been to New York knows New Yorkers think that they're better than everybody else. Maybe they are. Colorado, Denver is an athletic city. And you go there, and when you look at its climate action plan, it's all about cycling. It's all about making Colorado the place to be as fit as you possibly can. And I know this seems a little bit superficial, but superficiality or norm setting really matters. And if we look just very briefly at what Portland has done, we can see how some of these things play out. So Portland has one of the most active climate action plans, and it's also the oldest climate action plan. And it built it and then refined it basically under this greener, hipper, better metric. And so when we think about the greener, Portland, actually if you go onto Portland's website, the City of Portland website, Portland is the sustainability city. That's what it says. That's how Portland markets itself. And everything comes from this idea of Portland being the best, the most sustainable city. And it has a long legacy of being sustainable. It sees itself as a leader, and it gets the community to embrace what Portland is doing based on this norm-setting behavior. So this is Portland. Everybody here knows where Portland is. If we think about Portland's history and how its history taps into this sustainability image, and then how its future climate action taps into this sustainability action, what we can see is how effective Portland has been in developing a system based on its own norms. And so Portland became well known as a sustainable city, in part through enacting one of the most rigorous urban growth boundaries. So we can get a sense of this just by looking at where the city ends and the forests begin, leading up to Mount Hood. This is another example of the urban growth boundary, and you can see the city stops and the countryside begins. And once Portland had developed this urban growth boundary and then began to basically market it as part of the city's metric, it paved the way for Portland to go beyond that and start developing climate action plans. So Portland had the first climate action plan in 1993, and it had the most aggressive one at that point, and then it changed it. And it changed its emissions levels in 2001 because it realized it wasn't going to meet its mandate. It had been too aggressive, basically, and had not anticipated the rate of population growth that it would see. So it revised the mandate, and then it decided in 2009 to revise it again, but to extend it over a much longer time frame. And I'm going to actually say that this is probably a smarter way to think about the role that cities play in climate mitigation. Cities are not going to be getting the direct immediate emissions reductions through their climate action plans. Cities are going to get long-term systemic changes built in that are going to take a longer period of time, but they might actually be more permanent and protected if they actually engage in the long game in terms of climate mitigation. So what has Portland done? It's done all of the stuff that I said that cities basically can do. Land use, building efficiency, waste, food, and trees, and it's enacted certain very weak renewable energy mandates. So land use and transportation, as I already noted, Portland has a reputation for this. But what I wanted to emphasize is how Portland has used its norm-setting function as the way to implement these things, both through basically doing urban density and infill planning, and then through using its alternative transportation measures as a way to get the city involved in Portland's climate action plans. So if we think about infilling, for example, this is a big part of Oregon's climate mitigation strategy, is to reduce urban sprawl. But it's had basically its poster child of how Portland could change as a city into a city that has much more infilling and livable communities. And this is actually an old industrial rail yard site that is now the Pearl District. And Portland basically uses this imagery as a model of how you can effectively mitigate local emissions by changing basically the aesthetic of the city and getting people to get rid of their cars and embrace high density urban living. And so you'll see pictures like this all over Portland's web pages. If you look at the Pearl District, it's actually designed to be specifically a transit-oriented district. It's meant to have high urban density. Many of the buildings are basically designed without parking spaces, and they're basically designed to encourage people to use public transit and to walk as much as possible. And the way that the city emphasizes this is basically by tying into Portland's green image and Portland's hip image, because the Pearl District is sort of the uber hip area of the city. What else has Portland done? Everybody who knows a little bit about Portland probably knows about Portland's cycling culture and infrastructure. It's not by happenstance. The city itself markets this and embraces it. So we see the bike boxes. This is a bike path where this is the steel bridge. There's a basically river level bike path that connects the east and west sides of the Willamette River. The funky aspect of Portland's biking community gets emphasized. If you happen to live on a bike boulevard, you get these cool little bike signs near on your street signs so that people want to embrace Portland's biking culture. And then Portland has invested in other types of alternative energy its streetcar and its light rail as ways to get people to actually embrace public transportation. It even has pretty pictures of buses, right? And so what we've seen is actually this works. So Portland has had increased cycling rates of 230% from 2000 until 2009. It's been relatively cheap to do. And it has actually spurred entirely new economies built around the cycling culture, including new bike shops, bike design, bike building, etc. And so Portland is marketing this as economic benefit. Public transportation, especially the embracing of light rail. Well, light rail is really expensive, I want to note that. But we see Portland's ridership on light rail has increased. Every year is a new record year in terms of light rail riding. And then Portland is now emerging into electric vehicle infrastructure development. Basically, it got some big federal grants to design a couple of electric avenues, which are supposed to be vehicle charging stations. And it's doing this to create the image of this being the norm. And hopefully at some point the vehicles will follow. So it's sort of an if you build it, they will come idea. Now I want to emphasize that this isn't a panacea. I mean, there's leakage issues. When we think about leakage, we basically think either about you increasing certain things and restricting emissions, and that results in emissions increases somewhere else. Or leakage can just refer to the limited scope of your regulatory power. And when we think about a city like Portland, the big thing about its limitations is just that Portland encompasses only a fraction of the urban arena around Portland. And especially if we think about Portland's urban responses, what it's not addressing are the suburb to suburb commuting or the feeding commuting from communities that are located outside of Portland, but where people commute in. And so if we look at the metro region, and people might be aware of the Columbia River Crossing Project, which is designed to build the bridge over I-5. That's the bridge that's crossing over the Columbia River between Vancouver and Portland. We see some backlash in response to Portland's mitigation actions from local other outside communities, basically saying we don't want to do that, and we're not going to follow along Portland's path. So I'm not saying that it's a panacea and that cities can do it all, but certainly domestically, within the scope of the city boundaries, we're actually seeing some pretty significant emissions reductions. Just a couple of other things that I want to emphasize about Portland and come back to, and I'm going to skip over the rest of this so we have time for discussion, is just that I think that we have to embrace the idea that municipalities aren't going to get the big hits in emissions reductions immediately. But they are going to play a meaningful role in terms of promoting incremental change. And if we look at climate change as not just an issue of emissions from smokestacks, but it's basically about the behaviors that we all engage in and the types of demands that we place on energy sources, in particular, and transportation sources. Looking at the demand side is a really important way in which we can think about changing our societal needs. And if we do that at the local level, we have seen that these local initiatives can filter up to the state level and then ultimately put the pressure on federal agencies and the federal government to act. It's not the only approach. I don't want to suggest that in and of itself it would be a successful approach. But it's also not something to overlook, because if we think of climate change as ultimately this deeply human problem, the way that you start to address this is at a human scale. And cities are one of the places in which you can do that. So I'm going to stop right now so that we can have a few minutes for questions for Jolene and me. Hi, Julia.
Hi, Mom. Thank you. It was a really great presentation. I'm wondering, is there a place, I've seen on EPA's website some links to websites of local ordinances that different cities have in place, but are there some favorite local ordinances that you've seen or that are available that other cities can model after to implement some of these kinds of actions?
So, yes. I mean, I actually think that three of the three best climate action plans, but I'm going to change the word ordinance to plan and then suggest what we might do to change plan to ordinance. Portland has a really comprehensive one. New York City for an urban, an essentially urban, intensely built city, has a really good one if you're looking at high population cities. And Denver, which is all about the sprawl, has a pretty good one for a city that's your typical sort of Midwestern, Western city. So those are three that I actually think are quite good and quite comprehensive. The one thing that I actually think that people should be doing locally, though, is forcing the cities to actually build in accountability into their climate action plans. So I'm talking about norm setting as being great. But if we look at what happened with Portland, it didn't comply, and then it changed its plan, and then it changed its plan. Once we get a good plan in place, we should actually now force our cities to hold themselves accountable. Because that's what you don't see, is you don't see ordinances or mandates that are strictly enforceable. And we need to start to making the climate change an enforceable measure, not just an aspirational one.
So do those types of ordinances that would implement the climate action plan not exist?
Where you'll see them and where they can be really effective are building codes, for example, where usually building codes are some of the more enforceable, built into the system, and you can hold somebody accountable for complying. Transportation, Oregon's actually land use code is also an enforceable metric, although the boundaries can get revised, but they have to at least go through rulemaking to get revised. So those are two areas where we see that they're mandatory. Transportation planning tends to be a lot squishier, and so maybe we need to build into transportation planning more meaningful, enforceable metrics. Yeah. Yeah.
You go ahead. You go ahead.
Okay. I was at something where they wanted to build into the building codes, or the later building codes were oriented more to a disaster like earthquake. And I wanted to find out, well, where do I run to? Where is the safe building? The one with the later building codes. But the earlier building codes mean they're more shaky. And somehow I lost the contact with it. But I don't see built into any of the climate change worst case scenarios. And that's my question. Who's working on this worst case scenarios, which we seem to be seeing worse and worse of climate events?
So what you're talking about is basically the response to climate change as opposed to climate. So mitigation refers to efforts to reduce emissions and reduce climate change. And adaptation refers to responses to deal with the consequences of climate change. And we do see now in certain hard-hit areas, such as in response to Hurricane Sandy, new codes coming in that are basically requiring buildings to become more resilient to the consequences of climate change, such as increased storm surges, et cetera. But in general, many cities aren't really working on that. We're still in mitigation mode. We're still trying to avoid climate change as opposed to respond to the consequences of climate change. Yeah.
Two or three quick questions. You said that people in China are not necessarily aware of the problem of climate change. In the United States, probably elementary school, high school students, they're taught in their science classes. They probably know more about this than anybody. Is that the same in China? Are they being taught as well about the problem of climate change?
I think there is an awareness that, for a lot of environmental issues, starting with, kids in school and elementary education would be really helpful. It's actually very difficult because just to generalize, because the education system in China is highly fragmented. In the state schools, no, I don't think. I've actually asked a number of people who teach in state schools, like whether they talk about climate change, and no, that hasn't been really taught. There are efforts to do so, but I think it's really slow. Just because there isn't like that sort of awareness. It has to start from somewhere, but the thing is that without a spark, it hasn't happened. But in the cities, I think there's a lot more initiatives, particularly by private schools, starting with foreigners working in the cities and bringing their awareness and filtering it through to the system.
What about as a spark, air pollution?
Yeah.
For example, in northern China, and my real question here is, what about coal? Coal is like 40% in the United States and China of emissions, something like that. Yeah. And that's where the most can be done immediately. Yeah. What do you both see happening in coal, particularly in Shaanxi province in China and in our Midwest? I've flown down the Ohio River, and there seems like there's a coal plant every 50 miles. And in China, you can't see anything in northern China around Beijing.
Okay. With coal, there's a lot of investment right now and research in clean coal technology. This is pretty much driven by the private sector and also the government being quite aware that clean coal is probably, a lot of there's been a lot of hype about clean coal, even though we haven't seen very promising results yet. On that front, there is a massive R&D cooperation agreement between the European Union and China, where there is this sort of technology sharing aspect to it. As I mentioned briefly, I think there is a great awareness of the environmental and public health impact of heavy reliance on coal. And one of the things that China, the central government is putting its dollar on is on nuclear, which I do not think is anything to be proud of, because a lot of the environmentalists quite a few environmentalists in China are very, very concerned about the nuclear safety, especially because of the lack of transparency, and of course the nuclear waste disposal and issue. So I think, as Melissa was saying, like how local governments can tap on local concerns and try to deal with climate change as part of it. I think there's some of that going on, where conventional air pollution, really pretty much caused by heavy reliance on coal, is being tackled, and in that way, climate change is being addressed.
And really briefly, in the U.S., there probably will not be new coal plants built, other than ones that were approved a few years ago. They can't get insurance because the risk of building new coal plants, in light of the prospect that there will at some point be climate regulation, is too high. And as for existing coal plants, many of those are actually being shut, primarily because of the Clean Air Act regulatory regime that is being applied to domestic or conventional pollutants. And so we'll still have a coal fleet, but natural gas actually equaled the amount of coal last year, and actually renewables outpaced both natural gas and coal capacity development for the past couple of months. Now, I want to note the renewables are still a small fraction, but I think we're moving away from coal domestically. That's why people want to export it. So, yeah.
It seems to me that people work on this from the grassroots, like the locavore movement, stress local self-reliance and the local economy. But U.S. cities, just like Chinese cities, are always trying to attract business. The bigger the better. So is there any way to get that local self-reliance idea percolating upwards as city government?
Yeah, I mean, you actually see that in some cities that have begun to embrace smaller industrial facilities or more high-tech industrial or high-tech economies. And, it's an interesting thing, because for a long time the idea had been that if you regulate greenhouse gas emissions in one city, you promote a sort of this waterbed effect where people will leave that city and go somewhere else. But actually, there are a couple of studies that show that the more advanced and livable your city is environmentally, the more attractive it is to newer businesses to move in, because the people want to live in those cities. And so that can work both ways. And if you market it well as a livable city, people actually want to locate their businesses there. Now, not all businesses are going to want to locate in Portland, and I'm not suggesting that they will. But we have seen New York attract new types of businesses, Denver attract new types of businesses, Portland attract new types of businesses, based on spinning this idea of livable communities as well. So you can do it. I'm not saying it's going to be a panacea.
We have time for one more question.
Yes, with regard to building new natural gas plants in the third year, at least, once we build it, they will use it. How do you see us trying to avoid as many as possible of these? And is there a danger in shutting down the coal plants too quickly and forcing, creation of new investment in natural gas? Or it might be better to shut down the coal a little more slowly to allow for more sustainable alternatives?
So that's going to be on a facility by facility basis, the question of whether shutting a coal plant down immediately is the best result. And there, the first way that you actually can mitigate the buildup of natural gas in response to declining coal is actually by reducing demand. Because the general rule is that when a company, if we have a regulated utility, a utility that produces the energy that they ultimately sell to us, when they go to build a plant, they have to get the regulator's approval to make that investment in the plant. And the way that they get the regulator's approval is by showing that there's demand. And so if they cannot show that there is the demand necessary to justify construction of new natural gas plants, then they shouldn't get the authorization to build. Oregon is actually pretty good about how it investigates or how it reviews and authorizes new plant construction. I just lost my train of thought. I'm sure I had something else really good to say there, but I can't remember it. I think we're actually
So you replace the energy used by the new plant with demand-side management, and you don't need a new plant.
That's basically what I'm saying. And the other thing that I'll just note is that the other way that we get energy is not just through coal or the construction of new facilities, but we in a lot of places already have excess capacity. And one way to therefore avoid construction of a new plant is basically to tell the utility, we actually have plenty of energy out there, go and buy it at wholesale from somebody else. And if we move away from the idea that the utilities themselves need to invest in these facilities, that's another way to do it. And then the last thing that I'll just note is that if we got more people advocating for localized renewable energy production and some more active advocacy in terms of storage of energy, we would actually be able to offset some of this demand for natural gas. But it really requires people getting involved at the PUC level, which most people don't do.